Hello family, my name is Oyama Mdleleni. Welcome to my YouTube channel. On this channel, I talk about God's people, God's promises, and God's principles. Thank you for joining me. Today, I am going to be talking about the covering of God. In the Garden of Eden, we know that the Garden of Eden is God's garden. So I'm going to just be sharing 3 things that I think were the reason why God wanted us to be under his covering. So God places Adam in the Garden of Eden. This is after God has formed an Adam from the ground, and he has breathed through his nostrils the breath of life. Now he is a living being. God places Adam in the Garden of Eden, and in the Garden of Eden, God first tells him that he's going to tend and keep the garden. That's the first thing God tells him, because we also need to put in also our weight. We also need to, whatever God has given to us, that we have the dominion over. As God, when God was making the creation, he said we have dominion over all living creatures, the animals in the sea, those that are creeping on the ground, all the animals. Us as human beings, we have dominion over them. That means we need to look after them. Even the sea, the land, we need to look after them, as God has placed us as keepers and as for us to guard and look after them, so that they don't deteriorate and degenerate because we're not looking after them. So that's the first thing that God tells him, that he must tend and keep the garden. So it means that he was looking after it. He was making sure that there's maintenance. If now we're going to bring it to our days, where now if you're looking after your home or your car, that you maintain it, you take it for service, you paint your house now and again when there's a need, you pay your bills, your water, your lights, your rates for the house that you live in. So those are the things that, if we were to bring it now to nowadays, where time we are living in, and God tells him that Noah can eat. There's trees. God tells Noah that he can eat in every tree that is in the garden, except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So God tells him that he can eat from the tree of life, every tree in the garden, which is the tree of life, except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God commands him not to eat from that tree, and then God tells him that if he does, he will surely die. And then when we take it also with our own kids, when we have kids, that we're going to place some boundaries, where we tell our kids that you clean your room, that is the part of now the keep and tend. Tell our kids to clean their rooms, to look after the things in the house. Once you've used something, if you've taken something out of the fridge, that you put it back, you put the lid, the bread, you wipe the kitchen counter after you've made yourself a sandwich. So you look after the things that you've given your kids. Even the stationery that you buy them, or the clothes that you buy them, you tell them to look after those things, because that is the part that they have to play, as you are the parent and you are instructing them to do those things, to look after the things that you've given them as the parent who loves them and cares for them, so that they value those things even more, and also that there's that mutual respect between the two of you. So now when God now puts this boundary in terms of telling him that he may eat this and not eat that, that's the same thing we also do with our children, where we place boundaries I believe boundaries, God placed these boundaries for our own protection. Because when he places these boundaries, he's telling us that if we are safe when we are within those boundaries, but when we go outside of those boundaries, that there's consequences, that bad things happen. Like you're telling your kids that you should be home by this time, you should not go with such friends, or you should not watch such movies or listen to such music. So those are the boundaries that you are setting. You should speak like in this manner to people older than you, or even your peers. This is how you treat others. So those are the boundaries that you are setting. Also, even the boundaries that say you don't talk to strangers, you tell me if someone has touched you in a manner that is uncomfortable. So those are boundaries that when we tell them, it is for their own protection, that we are covering them at that time. That's the same thing, but for God it is even greater. Sometimes, yes, we can compare how we live our lives in terms of the instructions or the commands, or even the relationship that we have with our Lord, because we are made in his image and likeness. So there's bound to be similarities, but we know that he's infinite. So that means he's endless. His love is endless, his patience. He is patience, he is love, he is peace, he is joy. So we are not. We are flawed. We as human beings, we are flawed. We sometimes we need to work on our patience, we need to work on our peace, we need to work on our joy. We need to have these emotional maturities that we learn, because there's things that we need to unlearn. And as when we have children, it is us educating ourselves now over again in terms of how do we now have better communication and better communication and better relationships with our children, especially when you have seen some gaps in how you were also parented by your own parents, and then you want to do better with your own children. But it is a learning process. You're bound to make mistakes again, but as long as you recognize those mistakes and you learn from them, and you also acquire outside assistance, and also bring these issues to the Lord, I believe that's how we are vulnerable. That's how we, under his covering, we are vulnerable, and we can share all these big wins, and also these these events that make us shameful and leave us with all these regrets. Those are the things that we need to bring before him, so that he's covering us, and that we trust in him, that if we bring these things before him, he's going to, as our father, as our daddy, he's going to attend to them, and therefore we need not worry about them anymore, because he's doing something about them. That is what. Now, okay, I'm on another. Now I'm talking about another. I'm just expanding on this conversation. Now, this is also a topic that also gives me an interest in terms of God's covering. When we're talking about God's covering, I think I'm going to also expand on this one for the next episode. When we're talking about God's covering, the Garden of Eden is God's covering. When we abide when we abide to God's commands, as he has mentioned or given them to Adam in the Garden of Eden, in God's covering, as we do what he has told him, tend and keep. And then he tells him that these are the boundaries, you do this, you don't do that. And then lastly, in the Garden of Eden, God says it is not good for a man to be alone. And then now we see God creating animals to start to see first if are they in sync with Adam. And God tells him, brings the animals, the living creatures before Adam. Adam starts naming them, and the Bible tells us that each name he gave the living creature was its name. So now God is in sync with Adam, and God creates Eve, who is Adam's comparable helper. God creates Eve, who is Adam's comparable helper. As God said, it is not good for man to be alone. Now we see that also under God's covering, God creates relationships. God creates relationships that it is not good for men to be alone. While in his covering, God forms these relationships as part of his covering. That when we have relationships that of course are God ordained, we know that it is God who has sent these people to our lives, that those relationships are also covered in God's covering. So I'm just going to recap again. With God, in God's covering, we tend and keep what God has given us, what God has given us as dominion over, which is living creatures, the land and the sea, not other human beings. God does not give us dominion over other human beings, and therefore we do not dictate what happens or control and manipulate what happens with other human beings. We can only control ourselves as God has given us the dominion in terms of our own feelings, our emotions, what we speak over our lives, what comes in, as it says, guard your hearts, what we listen to, what we speak, and what we watch. Those are what we have control over. We cannot control. God has not given us dominion over other human beings, but he has given us dominion to look after what he has created for us to enjoy. God's abundance, which is God's, the animals that he has created, the sea, the land, all that the beauty that God has created for human beings to enjoy and also to create from. Then he says God keep and tend now to all those things that I've just mentioned. And then God tells him that he gives him boundaries, that you can eat here, but you cannot eat here. There's also boundaries that God gives us in the Bible, where he tells us that for sexual boundaries, that you cannot sleep with your father's wife, or your neighbor's wife, or your sister, or husband's child. God gives us all those boundaries in terms of also what we cannot eat, that we mustn't eat fat or live blood. He gives us all these commands. It is for our own good. It is for our own protection that God gives us all these boundaries. Like parents do with their kids, when you set boundaries with your own kids. And then thirdly, God says it is not good for men to be alone, and he creates a comparable helper for us, that now those people have to be God ordained. We cannot just choose anyone, but are those the people that God has ordained for your life, that God has aligned for your assignment and your calling? Has to be the right people, and those people are under God's covering. When we do all these things, we do not move away or remove ourselves from God's covering, because God's covering will always remain. It is us who detach ourselves from God's covering. It is not God who moves away, but ourselves, we detach ourselves from the boundaries that have been set for us, from the protection that God has set for us. We are the ones who move away when we do not abide, when we are not obedient to the things that God has commanded us to do. Therefore now we become exposed. We become exposed to the tactics of the enemy. We become exposed to the Bible tells us that weapon will be formed. We become exposed now to those weapons. And even though those weapons will not, weapons will be formed against you, we know those weapons will not prosper. But still now, because we've moved ourselves away from God's covering, and therefore we expose ourselves to those weapons, yes, they will not prosper. Whenever we try to move back, we'll try again to cultivate again our relationship with God, those weapons will not prosper, because we're under God's covering. So God's covering is very important. And I don't think these are the things that God calls from us are even difficult things, but because the enemy has placed in us this thing of when God tells us all these things that he says we must not, commands us not to do, the enemy plants this thought that says God is controlling, that I want to do what I want to do, I'm my own boss, I want to live my life, I want to enjoy my life, as if God said we must never have a life that is full of joy, full of love, full of abundance. Those are the things that also God wants for us. But when we start to have these thoughts that have been placed on us by the enemy and even by culture, that says you live your life, you hustle, and you do all these things outside of God's covering, and therefore we expose ourselves. We expose ourselves to the enemy's attack on our lives. And we all know that the Bible tells us in John 10:10 that his only purpose is killing, stealing, and destroying. So when he accomplishes those things in our lives, now we are exposed and we do not have God's covering, because we are outside the will of God. I hope you enjoy this content. Please do subscribe to the channel, like and share this video. I hope to see you again next time then. Goodbye.